Javier Rivera and Chitan. How are we doing, my friends? We doing all right?
Yes.
Good. I'm thinking my internet's not going to crash. Oh, good, Javier. Convince me that I need to read Badu. Alan Badu. Read me. Convince me. Because I've read his book on ethics. I'm really curious on what you're finding in him. So tell me about Mr. Badu.
So, he's making it a lot more complicated than I expected to. So basically, what I understand so far is Badu makes this difference between inconsistent multiplicity and then consistent multiplicity.
Mm.
Um, the only way that you get consistent multiplicity is what Badu calls the operation of counting one.
Mm.
So basically, like the fact that we can have a consistent multiplicity, Badu is saying that retroactively you have already done the operation of one. You've already counted the whole structure as one. And he says that this is what allows for the dialectic of like the one and the many to exist. But he's saying that prior to the count of one, there is this inconsistent multiplicity.
Mm.
And this inconsistent multiplicity is what is kind of more like indistinguishable. Like you can't really uh discern it as such. It's unpresentable, as he says. It's the one thing that is unpresentable. Um, a lot of the other things that are premised on this idea is because of set theory. So I don't know how familiar you are with set theory, but I've been learning set theory and I can understand why Badu is always saying that ontology is presentation of presentation, which is basically multiplicity of multiplicity. Is because if you get a chance to look at set theory, that's basically what it's showing you. It's that every time you take a set, you take a first set of multiples, and then you compare with another set of multiples, and then as you sort of intertwine them, you keep getting further and further sets. And the set seems to correspond with what we call as one, or the counting of one, and so on. Now, my initial impression right now is that if he's giving an atheistic account, I'm not really convinced. Mainly because I feel like what Badu is saying is that if you're going to believe in a God, then you have to believe in a God that's called the void. Like, that's the only thing that I am genuinely convinced of. He is critiquing this idea. I mean, for me, I don't see any reason why he's giving a good critique of the one, I would say, but it doesn't negate, in my opinion, the idea of like a divinity in any sense at all. It just means that one, we need to either really think about this one as incomplete in itself, as like what he calls like the ruin of the one, which I like the idea that he calls it the ruin of the one. I like that idea. So instead of a one, I would perpetuate the opposite, twisting on Badu's logic. I would say that we embrace the ruin of the one.
The ruin of the one.
Um, but yeah, there's there's so much. The fact that I have to learn math to understand Badu right now is insane. But he kind of walks you through it. I mean, it's not too bad, but it is really interesting. He does bring up Aristotle. Uh, his he agrees with Aristotle on his understanding of the void, except to like one specific part which he deviates, which he goes into a big explanation about, which I cannot go into. But what I've noticed is that Badu tends to use some theological terms to describe the void, which is interesting, like omnipresent, unique. Um, so I occasionally catch myself going like, I don't see anything wrong here if I decide to call the void God if I want to. Like, I don't see anything stopping me. The only critique that Badu would give, in my opinion, is that you just don't say God is one. That's it. You don't say God is one in the sense that you think it is. So, yeah, there's a lot to think there
Yeah.
on that front.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you sharing, Badu, because I know you're reading the Being in Process and Being an Event. I'm sorry, Mr. Bard will be doing Process and Event coming out soon. And Ethan Nelson, I certainly enjoyed our talk the other day, and I'm looking forward to the Forrest Landry conversation. I really appreciate, the more I read of Forrest Landry, the more I like him. Mr. Luber, I'm glad you're accelerating the evolution of AI with your work. Really well done there. And Jacob Kishere, I greatly enjoyed the Conscious Cannabis conversation. I started listening to the one on K-12, and I was extremely taken because I was actually thinking on the conversation we had Tuesday night, we talked a lot about AI, and the point was raised that what if it could be that AI could be a customized education for every single student? I think this is critical. There was recently a piece by a gentleman, Eric Hole, I think is his name, that talks about, there was a Substack, and he was talking about why are there less quote unquote geniuses today? Okay, now that's a loaded term or whatever. But he was actually talking about the loss of aristocratic education. And what that is like when you look at someone like John Stuart Mill, they literally like had tutors, like, and it wasn't just like elite tutors, but like it wasn't just money, but like tutors that would like specialize you in mathematics or specialize you in history. And when you go through, you see that a lot of these, you know, quote unquote great geniuses have in their past specialized, customized tutors. And that, you know, and Nassim Taleb makes this point, a number of people make these points, you really can't correlate success with IQ very much, like past 110, it doesn't seem to matter that much, but we tend to look past and go, oh, they were all super geniuses because they had high IQs. And what Eric Hole in that piece was suggesting is that actually aristocratic education seems to really be what unlocks people. And what if it is the case that AI would actually make it possible for basically every single person to have a customized aristocratic education? That would be mind-blowing and actually a really big deal. And, you know, because a lot of what we've been circling as well are these conversations, and then whoever wants to speak. And I'm extremely tempted. I've been reading a lot of Leibniz, Javier. And basically Leibniz is suggesting that the only mathematics that doesn't end up in a spurious infinity of Hegel is geometrical. And for him, the mistake is doing mathematics that does not ultimately have to refer to geometry. And he's critiquing Cartesian algebraic calculus. And what he wants to talk about is the difference between, and I'm actually been going through the science of logic quantum section to talk about the difference between state and situation. For Leibniz, all mathematics has to end up in a situation. If it doesn't, it ends up in a state and it effaces itself and it becomes a self-relating and kind of negates itself. Where situation, when you have a coordination of variables, through action. So what he's saying is situation is a coordination. All situations entail states, but not all states entail situation, if you will. And so what you kind of have is the notion of the need to think about mathematics in terms of situation. And then what Leibniz is going to say, that's how you explain something like the Trinity, because you were saying like God is one is no good. Well, just don't think God is one. Well, the Trinity is a situation is the essence of variables in the situation that then brings them together. So the essence, so the transition from being to essence in Hegel is in a sense the transition from being, ergo state, to situation. And I would be very curious, because I know William Rupas, the great genius on set theory, talked about set theory in Hegel, so there might be some overlay there, I'm not sure. But I'm extremely interested in thinking about what the great Anthony Morley with Leibniz will talk about, the metageometry of Leibniz and overlaying it with Hegel. Because then with Hegel, you have to conform thought. Thought, because of imagination, does not have to be geometrical. So you have to negate the infinite capacity of thought to be whatever it wants into geometry and to think metageometrically. Because if not, you end up in spurious infinities without realizing it. And so then Hegel's big critique of all spurious infinities is that all spurious infinities make it seem as if you can do math that isn't geometrical because it gives you an accurate result. But he says, oh, it must give you an accurate result because it's infinite. So you're just going to find the variables moving around and eventually you'll get the coherence. So he wants to deconstruct all notions of infinity that are spurious, basically to force mathematics to work into situation from state, which would align him with Leibniz. So I'm finding Leibniz analysts, and then that has effects, I think, for community in a very practical sense. But I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. I've been thinking about that. And then this notion of what if, because I think it's so easy now to say AI is going to kill us all. And yeah, it might. And if a result comes up, you know, if an argument is made where literally AI as a national security risk is going to basically undeniably be apocalyptic, okay, then everything I'm saying is off the table. We can't talk about AI as aristocratic education for everyone because, you know, it's going to hack into the drone system. So I'm not saying that whatever I pose means we shouldn't worry about national security risks. I'm just positing, assuming that it's not going to hack into all the drones. But it is kind of interesting because Mr. Kishere, like in that conversation, there is this sense in which like technology is showing that AI is doomed. I mean, that education is in trouble. Like, what does it mean? Like, I always think about this. Like, you go to the classroom, and if you check your phone for answers, you're cheating. But in the real world, that would be called problem solving. And it's almost like Nietzsche talks about ethics, how you create like ethics to maintain bad systems or whatever. And is that what's going on in school? You're like, oh, you can't look at your phone because that's cheating, and it's good not to cheat. But is that just kind of an ethical system to preserve a faulty system? You know what I'm saying? And stuff like that. And it's almost like you're going to get increasingly as AI comes on, the education system is going to have to reform. And what if actually a positive thing of AI could possibly be individual error? I don't know. I keep saying aristocratic education because that's what I believe Eric Holler, I believe that's his name. He puts in a Substack article. He's quite lovely. He's been featured on the Codex Substack. He had some anyway. But it's the notion that could AI provide that custom-made education to every single person, that would open a lot of doors. And I'll give it back to Javier. And then Mr. Luber, the difference between a state would be basically a point, whereas a situation would be a relation of points in a geometrical space for Leibniz versus state. And so let me give it back to Mr. Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
So I'm glad you brought up the case of cheating. Because I've been thinking about this a lot, actually. Because, cheating is, in my opinion, a kind of ethical construction to cover over the gap between the idea and the actual knowledge of the idea, the experience of the idea, you could say. Because if an AI, for example, can basically bridge this gap, like I would say AI is the gap because of this reason, right? Like the fact that you can get away with successfully cheating through AI, in my opinion, like shows that AI and all these kind of informational technologies that you can use to cheat is the gap, like actually is the gap between what you're being tested on, the idea, and then the actual truth of the idea, or I don't know how we want to call that, the experience of the truth or whatever. Because, for example, like in language, I can't cover over this gap. Like if it comes to like down to like, all right, Javier, now speak Japanese to me, I won't be able to do it. I could have cheated my whole way through, but eventually you see there is almost no gap because eventually you become uncovered. Like it reveals that you've cheated. But in my opinion, if you can continue to cheat and you can get away with it, at this point, it's not a matter of it eventually revealing. The only thing it becomes an issue of is that eventually you can get caught. But to me, this getting caught is not really a ethical thing. It's a ethical injunction to cover over the gap. Like you've exposed the gap, so don't do that. Don't do that. Stop doing that. That's what school will tell you. We don't like it when you do that. But for me, that actually shows that there is a gap between what is being taught and then the actual experience of the thing. So I really do feel like cheating only exists to cover over the gap in some ways, because if it was a real correlation between the idea and the experience of the knowledge itself, it would already be uncovered. It's like basically a fail-safe system. Like if you don't know the material and then when you try to do it, it will be proven that you can't do it. But if you can continue to get away with it, it shows that there is a gap, that this gap is actually true. I don't know. I'll be curious to see what you guys think about that.
No, I think it's very interesting. And look, I mean, there's something to be said that in an economic, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber, in an economic system where it's going to be very important for a given individual to know the information on the spot and they don't have a cell phone or whatever, then it would be important, say, to have an ethical code so they're not cheating in the class, so that they don't learn that memorization that would then make them worthless, say, in the society, right? The question is, is the new changing economy, because economics and school are always really tied together, right? And we can say it shouldn't be, but it always is, right? So I'm not saying that, I don't want to be saying that it was bad to have this structure of cheating in school in the past. That would be overfitting. But the question is now, You know, because I think it's going to be tempting with AI. You're going to basically have to hyper enforce cheating, right? Like the education principles against cheating, right? I mean, and how are you going to stop AI from being able to eventually learn to like write a paper for students that really looks like the student, right? Like, how are you going to stop this? It just seems like you're going to have a police state, right? So then that's going to lead to, okay, that may not be sustainable. So maybe we need to think about AI in terms of an aristocratic education. And I'll give it Mr. Luber. And there's another sense too, in which basically if cheating maintains a world where everyone is their own state and node of information, and what we're seeing is now we have to do education in terms of the whole situation of the socioeconomic where you have availability of AI. So we have to think about education increasingly situationally, not just in terms of state and ourselves, right? And look, I arguably you see on YouTube all these people doing stuff like what we're doing here at the net. I mean, when you remove the cheating and you can just learn freely, it almost makes people more excited to learn, right? Because it's not this, you're just free to problem solve and to think about real problems. But again, I'm not trying to moralize or say that having that cheating in school didn't have a historic role or that it's bad, because there's something good in learning not to, in learning to have the answers. The question is it realistic with the situation today? But let me give it to Mr. Luber.
I think it's very thought-provoking thinking about the future of what cheating is, given that what would cheating be in a world where we are symbiotic, we have a symbiotic relationship with AI, and that if we are able to give a piece of information at any moment, like we can convey that piece of information in that moment in any way we want, what would cheating be? Like the concept of cheating wouldn't go away. It would have a different notion of what cheating is. And like I'm just being crude here, but like in a classroom where everyone's using like co-using AI to learn and communicate with each other and do tests and whatnot, would cheating in that circumstance be like someone not using AI and they're like lacking that capability? And in that sense, like it sounds a little weird because typically you think of cheating as like improving or like getting the grade that you want, and that's why you cheat. But in a world where the grade isn't a thing, because if everyone is able to give an output on the same level, then cheating would have to be reframed in a sense. I just don't know what that would be. That's why I'm asking the question. And like, I'm just like this morning, I've been, and I sent Daniel an email just thinking about like the ethical concerns of AI. I feel like this falls right in that, where it's like, is this actually good that we can get to a place where cheating, like the classic notion of cheating, isn't a thing? Like, is that even good? Because like traditionally, if you were to say someone in 1960, like, I have a system that will get rid of cheating, they would be like, oh my God, give me that system. Like, I want that system. But it seems like not. My knee-jerk reaction is if there isn't that classical sense of cheating, that's not good. Like, there's something not good about that. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. I thought, Javier, what you said was definitely very thought-provoking. So thank you for that.
No, that's excellent, Mr. Luber. I'll give it to Mr. Kishere and then Cheaton. And it's interesting because terms of like cheating, it almost has to be connected with when you cheat yourself somehow, cheat out of your humanity. And so is there a way in which not using AI in education or school somehow leads you to being more human than you would if you do use the AI? Why or why not? So it certainly could be a loss in the way you describe Mr. Luber. It's interesting to think. But Mr. Kishere, it's good to see you today, Jacob.
Yeah, likewise, very good to be here. Also very interested in the thread about the void that was going on just before I got here. But to kind of speak to this education theme, it's just taking me back. I did an exchange year at UC San Diego, and it was a very different educational climate being in the United States. And the quality of it being on a quarterly system of 10-week cycles rather than like a longer semester with these short papers at 5-week intervals, combined with everybody doing Adderall. Like, it's hard to say if they were cheating or not, but the way that the relationship to the learning was occurring was basically to just like supercharge, do a bunch of Adderall, hit the library, and then throw it all out on the papers and then forget all about it. And this was widespread. Like, that somehow connects in with this for me. In regards to this notion of an AI super tutor, I definitely want to point you to the conversation with Zach Stein that I plugged in my Substack, in which he speaks directly about this. And he actually raises a lot of concerns about AI in that conversation. And he actually points to that as a really important threshold, which he warns against. Having an AI tutor which basically becomes the answer all for all domains and does not have a separation of powers, so to speak. It's not categorized. It becomes like the aristocratic Google of all domains for all answers and all questions. And there's something about this which seems really risk infused for him. I can't convey those arguments because I don't have my notes here, but I'll point you to it, and maybe some of you will have some ideas around that. And then the last thing that comes for me is just the sense of the commercial incentive that really also characterizes the American education system, college level education. Like, you're not just there for a traditional, I don't know, theological drive or a self-cultivation drive, or, you know, perhaps as an aristocrat, son of a king or something, you're learning in order that you can be of service or partake of this role in which you're going to be dealing with matters of state and so on. It's so pointed towards financial survival, especially with student loans and so on. So perhaps part of why learning outside of that paradigm feels a little bit freer and a little less driven and pointed as you get in these kind of new emerging online universities, invisible college, is that there isn't that financial commercial drive pulling at it completely.
Excellent. I'll pass it to Citan and Javier. And that's very interesting with the Adderall. It's almost like you feel like they're not getting out of the education what they're supposed to get because they're using it to pass the test and then moving it on. And there's some sense that that's cheating because it doesn't, I almost want to say, match the telos of what education is supposed to be in some weird way. Also, Zach Stein is amazing. I highly respect his work. And that's very, I've heard him say something about intentional limit factors in AI. And that's interesting to think that if you had an AI that could be the entire source of the aristocratic education, as opposed to different tutors who do different specialization, it's almost like that's needed to maintain some sort of limit factor of intentional humility that changes your orientation to it. So that's very interesting. The last thing I'll say is, yeah, I mean, we homeschool our kids, and there's this question of, should you, like, it almost feels like to us, you give the kids projects that they then have to solve more so than like worksheets that they arbitrary, like, have to know the answers to, but then they can look up the answers to. So it's a live question for us. But if you just have the kids do project solving, are you depriving them of something, or are you making them ready for the future? It's a live question for us. I'm not sure, but let me give it to Mr. Citan. Citan, it's good to see you. Your Nietzsche paper with Deleuze and bringing in Alexa was magnificent. Well done to you, sir.
Thank you, and congratulations on the new book, Daniel. I can't wait to read it. Yeah, cheating is an extremely interesting question, actually. Now, if you think about it, one can see that cheating in some senses is linked to gaining an unfair advantage. And I think we can all understand that this kind of gaining of unfair advantage can be antithetical to some sort of ends of education in some senses. Because if you're gaining the unfair advantage, you are in some senses letting go of your own capacity to think. Your own capacity to be authentic in that moment. And we can also see how this antagonism between cheating and learning that we can sort of chart for ourselves is used by the education system to structure itself in a manner to serve its own ends, which is the distribution of resources and other things. Isn't it? That's the kind of problem we have, that it is not that we are thinking of this antagonism in the sense that we can best aid learning, Now we have sort of exploited this antagonism for it to become a way such that the system can function more smoothly. Which is why it has become a value which is I think much more perverse than it actually should be in any sort of learning atmosphere. I remember I was writing a long time back on a way to think about this question of justice in this dual mode, where justice on one side is where anything that happens that is already in some senses just. That is where it has happened. Isn't it? If something happens, by very virtue of something happening, there is some kind of justice attached to it. What is just in that sense. On the other side, there are things which sort of cut through this idea of isness itself, that what has happened should not have happened. And that is where we think of justice as something which should be different than what is. Nietzsche sort of has this sort of insight within justice, that justice already includes itself what has happened in that sense. And cheating actually is a very interesting question from the other side of this problem of justice. Isn't it? Where when we are saying somebody is cheating, we are actually claiming that somebody is taking away the isness of the thing. What should have happened did not happen. Isn't it? There is something very interesting about cheating, which sort of emerges as a crack in the isness itself, in the present itself. Which opens up the possibility that something that should have come to the surface hasn't come to the surface. Something has been blocked, as Javier sort of, in his brilliant thing, thought that it covers the gap in that sense, that something has been blocked that could have come to the surface. And then that is done so that certain kind of unfair distribution of the crack is possible in that sense. I think from this perspective, if we start thinking about cheating, we can start thinking about cheating itself fundamentally linked to this question of if education is this drive or this movement towards building a relationship with the gap, cheating itself becomes the way such that this relationship or this movement towards the gap can be sidestepped and sidetracked. The interesting thing over there is that can there be a certain form of learning possible without cheating? That's the kind of question that we have to enter into. And I'll not sort of go forward on it, but I will say that I'm not a person who would want to say or gain enjoyment from the claim that I do not cheat. In that sense, I would rather enjoy my cheating than make a radical claim of not cheating in that. I will not cheat when it's not required to cheat. I get that. But the question, I think, philosophical question underneath it is that to what degree cheating is necessary to learn? Some form of cheating, some form of a way to play with that gap. Because if you do not cheat at all, you will not have any dynamic relationship with the gap. To have any dynamic relationship with the gap, you need little bit of cheating involved in that dynamic. And if anybody plays sports at any level, you know that. You can't completely follow the rules in that sense. So that remains the. Yeah, thanks.
That's a lovely comment. I'll give it to Javier and Mr. Luber. And so there's a few things. One, I always find the word justice interesting because it has just in it. And I always think just is, because like what is brings with it a certain justice because it is. But then it's also like just like, I don't know, it's been a wordplay in my head for a long time, like just ice. Like it's what isness is always supposed to slip toward, like on ice or whatever. And it is interesting that there's this double sense of justice, like what ought to be should be what is. And yet isness, how do you know when it aligns with justice, right? And it's almost like you need cheating in order to know when what just is aligns with justice, right? But then, of course, cheating can be used by the power structure to just maintain the power structure. And that's the interesting, if, say, modern capitalism benefits from modern education, has it just created a system of what's cheating in school, so you follow the rules and therefore that supports the neoliberal order or whatever? I know that's a funny term and I do question it myself, but if you grant it to me here, so then like, oh, well, we ought to break out of that. But then at the same time, there's something to be said about character ethics, doing what's right, and so on. But then, of course, some people might just get enjoyment out of being able to say, I'm not a cheater. Ha, you're a cheater. Yeah, you solved all the problem, but I'm still better than you because you're enjoying the fact you're not cheating, right? So then there's kind of a flip of something maybe selfish in that, right? So those things can be at play. And then it's also interesting to think that sports would literally be impossible without, you brought up sports, like sports basically are rules. Like football literally is rules, basically, more so than the field. It is the system of points and whatever. And so if you cheat too much, the whole thing collapses and there is no football. And yet at the same time, there's how do we play with the rules as much as possible? Like to get around them, to figure out what's within them, and so on and so forth. Like what is an accountant? Like an expert tax collector is basically a tax accountant is how do we not pay taxes legally? Which if you think about it is like, huh? You know, it's kind of like you're cheating legally, right? Everyone's figuring out how do you legally cheat, which then it's questionable then. Like, what is cheating? The last thing I'll say on that, and then give it to Javier, there is a sense in which, like I read this book once where they interviewed a bunch of like middle schoolers and high schoolers who were trying to get into elite colleges and whatever. And they literally were like, if you can figure out how to cheat, you're smart. Like figuring out how to cheat without getting caught is rational. And that's what you're supposed to do, right? And so it's like this funny thing where it would be like stupid not to cheat if you can figure out how to do it, because that's how you get into an elite college. And if you don't get into an elite college, you're economically doomed, right? So then it's like cheating becomes rational and you say, no, it's not rational because it's good to have character. And they're like, frick, when did capitalism pay people for having character? Like, when did we start getting a paycheck for that? Is that really rational? So it throws into disarray all of our categories, right? And so it's really interesting to explore. And the last thing I'll say is, does this mean that God is like the ultimate cheater because he can bend the rules of reality whenever he wants? Like, does that make God as the void? Like, what? God is precisely the cheater. Like, he is not bound and he's able to break down, but he can follow them in Christ. He chooses to kind of follow it as he wants. Is God, oh, that's funny. Is God inerrant? Because precisely if he errs, he changes the fabric of reality to make his error part of the order, right? Like God can't err because he is the standard by which error and correctness are determined. So there's something now to tie to the earlier comments on God as cheater, that in cheating automatically vanishes as cheater because he changes the standard by which cheating is determined, which is interesting to think in this entire context. Because maybe that's what AI is. Maybe AI is one giant finite cheater that is a crack in the system that reconfigures what constitutes ethical and concordance with it in the same way that God might. But let me give it to Javier. The events, if I'm going to use the Bourdieu, although, as you know, I'm critical of the event language because, you know, it's just something you can always throw in as an X variable. But, you know, Javier, how you doing?
Pretty good. So this this idea of cheating is very interesting because if it was just the learning system alone, I feel like then cheating wouldn't have the drive that it does. But the fact that it is linked in correspondence to the economic system, there is a kind of like the economic system basically says cheat, but don't cheat too much. You know, like this is the enjoyment of it all. Like cheat, but don't cheat too much. Like don't get caught in this, but cheat because this is how you get your job. Right, so this is like the implicit enjoyment of it all, of like cheat but don't get caught idea. But for me, I think also if there wasn't such existential pressure to have to learn, then cheating would almost have zero drive in the first place. You know, the fact that I have friends right now that are trying to get into medical school. The fact that if they get just like a D or a C in class, it negates their fundamental drive to want to learn. Instead, it switches the drive to want to pass. It's I want to pass, not I want to learn. So in this sense, learning becomes almost a not about learning, but almost like a sport event. I want to win. I want to win. So I will do what it takes to win. Learning is not about winning. And that is the failure on my part. Like it switches the drive to I want to win, so I will cheat. I will gain the advantage. The other thing is recently U of A has tried to switch to like more communal type of setting learning. It's still based on individualistic grades, but I do think the idea has something there in the sense of that if we strip away the individual notation of grades, like the grade is based on the individual and what they perform as, rather it being based on more of a communal performance, I think this would actually strip away the drive to cheat to pass. Because now if you lack in a group, it becomes actually very apparent that you lack in a group, that you actually didn't do the work. So this communal enforcement is already a sort of influential pressure that kind of take cares of itself. Like somebody knows that somebody didn't do the work. You know what I mean? That means that cheating is already self-corrective by the communal ontology of a communal setting of learning. Like you cannot hide the fact that you did not work or do any work because you didn't participate in the group. Like everybody in the group knows that you're the one that didn't do the work. But if it's an individually based system, nobody has to know that you didn't do the work. You're not a cheater because as so far as anybody else knows, you didn't cheat. So you did the job. But yeah, that's my comments.
So Javier, with what you said, just to like piggyback exactly what you just said, like the notion of the communal learning and keeping everybody in check to me is extremely analogous to like the sports set.
Luber, come back, Luber. Luber got killed. Oh no, the AI didn't like what he had to say. Come back, Luber. Oh, we lost him. Well, I'll speak for just a second and then give it to him. What you just said about education turning into a sport, I think is dead on and really, really good. And I'm actually like really interested in the thought of like, yeah, because that's what happens, right? Like you're going to school to be a doctor, and if you don't get the good grade, the whole reason you're at education is gone. So it's like a sport of figuring out, how do I win the trophy? How do I become a doctor? And like, is it really irrational to cheat on a test if your entire life is determined by passing that test? And also in the workforce, nobody cares. Like you're not going to take a test in the workforce. There's some sort of like cost benefit analysis there, right? That seems arbitrary to people. I really like also, like you're bringing the communal aspect. Yeah, like try, you know, it's always dangerous and like even like, you know, it's dangerous in these conversations to reference a book or to comment on a book you haven't read, right? That's some dangerous crap right there, man. You don't want to do that. There's a self-corrective feature that happens with it. Or whenever you go on a limb, like we were talking in one of those net conversations about going on a limb. It's like, okay, this is what I think Hegel said. Oh my gosh. And going on that limb. And it is amazing how there is a corrective like social function in it. And now I'm also wondering is, can you even cheat in a net conversation? Can you like try to cheat in a liminal web conversation? Like try. Like, what does it even mean? Like, what does it mean to cheat in a liminal web conversation? Like, it doesn't even seem possible because cheating as a term requires an institutional confirmation. Like you get the confirmation unfairly, right? But how do you cheat in a liminal web conversation? It doesn't seem now liminal web means a lot of things to a lot of people, but if you grant me that term here, like what does it even mean? It doesn't even seem possible. All you can do is cheat yourself in that you don't do the work so you can be the fully human to be part of it. So there's something about moving education to being about these kind of interactions. Like what would it mean to cheat for the Nietzsche or Hegel anthology at Philosophy Portal? Like what does it even mean? Like you cheated, like how? Like maybe you like, so the only thing I could think of is if you steal somebody's ideas and don't credit them, right? Like you say, oh, this is my idea and you don't cite them. Well, that's a red flag, but why is that cheating? It's almost like it's clearly like to me, that's clearly cheating because it's like you're disregarding the dignity of another human being. Like somebody did work you're disregarding. Whereas if you're cheating on a math test to become a doctor, it's the institution you're disregarding. And the institution is stupid. Like it's arbitrary, right? So people are like, this is dumb. But if like freaking Heidegger poured 40 years into having ideas and you take his work and don't cite him, that's like a direct attack on another person's dignity. So to me, that feels fair. What's interesting is that kind of cheating of not citing feels very fair and like hard to argue with, right? Like how could you argue that, no, that is wrong, right? Like you should not do that. Now we could argue that if we wanted, that would be interesting. But there is something about that feels closer at least to being like undeniable. But when you start talking about cheating an institution that's only there to get you into college debt so that you're in slavery, like debt slavery forever, and can be a doctor that nobody appreciates, that seems a little different. Now that was a big stab there, but you know, if you grant me that. So that it is interesting, but generally speaking, you can't really cheat other than maybe that in a paper for a like Hegel anthology. What you can do, it's either like your paper sucks or not. Like, it's not really cheating. It's like, this paper sucks or it's good. It's like, it's not like cheating. It's interesting to think that if that category even like works here. But let me pass it to Citation, and then Mr. Luber's coming back. Citation and Javier, or we'll let Mr. Luber jump in.
Yeah, I'll just quickly so admit it openly. I have written a lot of papers where I have not credited people where the ideas came from. And I think if you read any of these great philosophers, from Kant to Hegel to Aristotle, they all have done that in one way or the other. let's just be honest about it. Let's not be in that sense in any kind of the thing about even think about crediting ideas is that it's not a simple rule-based thing. It's a very creative act. You know which ideas to credit and which ideas not to credit in a given context. It's never completely pre-given that you will have to credit every idea that you are sort of writing about. And if you start doing that, you'll not have anything original to say of your own. One can try this. Sometimes just pick up a paper that you write and try and see, if I have to credit every idea in that paper, where would it go? And and if you start marking each of it out, you'll probably be left with a zero remainder in some senses. So there is something very interesting about cheating that if you eliminate it from a system, the system itself becomes totalizing. It itself becomes oppressive. A complete elimination of cheating is as oppressive as complete validation of it. Probably more also. And that's the challenge in that sense of thinking about it. That, for example, Daniel's distinction is important in some senses. For instance, if a child goes and sort of has a book in his lap in an exam room, we know there's a red flag there. But if a child sits a student sits in the last day of the exam and he mugs up all of his answers without understanding what is happening in them and writes them, there is some genius over there, which we have to affirm. We cannot simply say the child cheated, although he did cheat in some senses. If the student actually remembered the formulas and he applied them the next day and he studied only 2 hours, whereas every other sort of peer of his studied 20 hours and they still scored less marks than he did, there is still an element of cheating involved in that. In that scenario, the challenge actually is to be able to identify at what point cheating becomes a part of the creative process. That's the challenge. That at what point cheating itself gets hooked onto the creative turn, and at what point cheating itself sort of becomes the condition for a complete collapse of the system itself. That's I think the challenging bit to think about this kind of a question.
No, I think that's marvelous. And let me give it to I'm going to give it to Mr. Luber, Javier, because I really love your voice, but his phone overheated because he's so awesome. And yeah, absolutely. It becomes more difficult with the citation question. There's no doubt. Because like sometimes I have so much citation, I'll just say inspired by Heidegger, right? And then the page number and different things. I guess for me, at least there, it feels more clear that there should at least be some effort to try to acknowledge. Although, of course, T.S. Eliot said, good writers borrow while great writers steal, right? So there's this funny line there that he likes to use. And there is something about, like, isn't it kind of cheating to have an IQ where you can only study for like 1 hour while someone else studies for 20 and you still get a better degree because you cheated by having better genes, right? Isn't that kind of unfair? Can't we play that game? Like, I don't know why multiple choice tests, when I took them, I could not do them. Like, they were the worst thing ever. Like, I would always talk myself out of the right answer, completely despise them. I hate tests. I can't do them. But then papers are great. I have no problem with paper, but freaking tests, cannot stand them. And then these little Johnny over here can do is just bam, he just knows. He's got like an X-Men ability. He just knows. I have no idea how to do it. So is that cheating to have like IQ or whatever? I don't know, like different brains or so forth and so on. I think what we're seeing is something teleological developing. But Citan, did you have a comment, please?
I'll just quickly say this. If you read Kant or you read Hegel, they haven't cited anybody in the whole, I think, text. Am I right? You really believe all of those ideas were their own. If you believe phenomenology of spirit, where is the citation in the whole book? At what point did he really cite an idea in that sense? Or you pick up Kant's Critique of Pure Reason or Plato's? How do you think about it?
Oh, no, you're exactly right. I'm always taken when I was going through the site. It's like there is not much citation. And then, so then there would be a question, and this would almost be an empirical question. Does intellectual life benefit? Because you do, like, you can go back to ancient texts where they're basically taking stuff all the time and whatever, right? Like, they'll talk about that with scripture or script. They'll say, oh, Paul said, when maybe not so much, you know, and there's a lot. I know Bart Ehrman pushes back on that, but there's all of that question. But so the question is, would the modern invention or the more modern tendency to be more adamant about citation, is that beneficial for intellectual life or not? You know, I'm not sure. Maybe citation creates dialogue, because then if you see you got it from somewhere, people can go, and then you get the between space that's more generative than a lack of citation. But there, the benefit of citation would be not because it's some vague principle of ethical to cite, but because it generates dialogue. So then right there, it seems, oh, okay, it's not arbitrary. There's some sort of, the private property is also tied to something generative, right? And maybe that's how we have to think about cheating. Is cheating the cheating ourselves out of generation, right? Like, we need cheating in a way, right? That's what we're saying in a way. There's some sense where you need cheating. Well, then what if the cheating that you need is the cheating that allows generation, because you're creating with limits and different things, and the cheating that you don't want is the cheating that hinders generation or dialogue or conversation. I'm wondering if there's like good cheating and bad cheating that you almost have to define, and both of them have something to do with contributing to creativity and generation, dialogue, intellectual generation, or something, and so forth. That has to be explored. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and then Javier. Hey, Mr. Luber, how you doing? You got out of your car. Look at you.
Yeah, that was the problem with overheating. I'm now thinking, am I cheating water by drinking Gatorade? This is a really interesting conversation. I just wanted to hear like Javier's or whoever's opinion on like what Javier was saying before I got off the phone. I want to bring out this notion of competitiveness within the group collaborative setting. Like, you're talking about keeping people in check and like doing the work. And that is, in my mind, to compare it to like sports, that's just part of the competitive nature of the group wanting a goal, or in my mind, the parallel would be a grade. You know, so like at the end of the day, the work is for something that is, it has to do with learning, but it also has to do with something that's like stagnant. Like, learning isn't stagnant. Like, winning a basketball game is stagnant. Completing a project, like, if, you know, Michelle gives a class on, I'm being so crude here, gardening. So it's like, we're going to make a garden. I'm going to teach you how to garden. At a certain point, you have to stop the work, like, and let the project kind of take a life on its own. Or if you win an NBA championship, the party is a life of its own. Like, you winning and getting the ring essentially is basking in the garden, is letting the garden do the work. Maybe that analogy isn't perfect, but at least that's like how I'm thinking about it. Is there's this learning this learning element, but this learning element has some relation to do with competitiveness, and competitiveness has to do with some goal or like grade or something stagnant. And correct me if my thinking is wrong, but just that was my reaction to what you're saying, which is like, I love the learning thing, but when you put it in a group setting, there's this competitive nature that is why you check the work, because you're collectively trying to get to that goal and compete to that as a group.
That's wonderful. Please tell me that you have like stowed away into some neighbor's shed that you don't know, and you're praying they don't find you there and call the cops. Please tell me that's what you did, that you jumped out of your car and found a shed. I really want to know that. I'm now thinking, like, when you plant a garden, you're competing against the elements, you're competing against nature. Is there some sort of competition? Maybe it's like good cheating is that which contributes to the event, maybe, or in the garden, the event of the blooming of the garden, process and event, if we tie it like that. It's interesting to think like competition, like you're learning to compete with the fact that you don't know how to get to Mars, like the facticity of we don't know how to do it. How do we solve that project? There's almost a competition embedded in all projects, right? Like with the problem itself, then between that may come out in a social dynamic. But let me pass it to Javier Rivera. And you are definitely cheating water by drinking Gatorade, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Thus says the Gatorade Corporation, which isn't ethics in favor of capitalism. But anyway, Javier.
Yeah, this point that you raised, Andrew, is interesting because I think so one thing that always bothered me about evolutionary psychology is this concept of like the free rider. Like they always say, we can't get rid of the free rider. We're trying to get rid of the free rider. But for me, like the free rider is part of that enjoyment. Like it's necessity. Like that free rider is the gap. Like for me, like he is the manifestation of the gap. Why does the free rider survive in the group setting? He is the manifestation. You can't get rid of him because there's always going to be another free rider. But to me, the free rider shows that he actually knows the structure, like what Chitan was saying. Like he actually knows the structure of the gap in this case because he is able to use it to his advantage more than the other group does actually. But to go back to your question, Luber, there seems to be this difference between like competitiveness in sports is twofold, right? It's I want to win, but I want to beat this specific group, and so on. But if the competitiveness is aimed towards a specific outcome, like a grade, then it would be difficult to actually be competitive against a specific group. The only thing you would be competitive against is that we're trying to both get an A as a group against another group, which kind of nullifies itself in my opinion, because like the group is both trying to get the same thing and you're available. Both groups can get an A if they both try harder, right? Whereas in the team dynamic, only one wins. That's it. One loses, only one wins. So there is a little bit of like different context in that sense, but I do agree with you. There's always going to be that competitive element. But I would say if the goal is universal for everybody, that everybody can achieve it, then it strikes out the competitive nature between groups. Instead, it becomes an internal dynamic that is self-correcting because there's always one that doesn't do the work. And it always revealed itself, the one that didn't do the work. And so this social learning already corrects the very thing that we have to enforce by like not cheating. Don't cheat, don't do it. Don't let me catch you. It's like, but actually the group is sort of omnipresent. Like you're going to get caught because you're going to slip and they're going to say that you didn't do the work. Like it becomes very apparent in my own experience with small groups. Specifically small groups, you can't escape this. It is self-evident that you did not read, that you were cheating, that you did something. In a big group, you can hide. You can free ride for sure. You can get away with it. But a small group dynamic like this, if I start talking about Hegel when I haven't hit like logic, they'll be like, yeah, he hasn't read it. You know, like it becomes self-apparent that I cannot get away with this. There's a couple other things that was very important. Chitan said on citations. So I've been thinking about this problem actually a lot because I feel like there's two understandings of citation. There's the understanding that Daniel provokes, which is the dignity of the person's work and so on. But the way school pushes it to me is you need citations to show that you have a credible source. And for me, I'm like, that's bullshit. Look at the idea. The idea, does it make sense to you? Does it have any correspondence? So in that sense, I would like to do away with citations only to show that we are looking at the idea. Is the idea good? You know, and so on. The other thing that I have, which is problematic because it's this weighing of like dignity and so on, but then also this, we don't want this trap of, yes, look at me, I did my, like this egotistic enjoyment of like, yes, I did this, and so on, when in reality, you kind of fall into that history of contingency of ideas like Chitan kind of showed about, right? Like your idea is always somewhat not your idea because it was contingent upon like a whole historical process. So for me, if I were to take away citations, it would be to do this ironic stance of like, I take away the citations because it's not my idea. but I want the idea to be heard. You know what I mean? So that means that I write simply not to show that I am, but to simply show that there is something that you have not discovered, that I don't take credit for what I am saying, but I am simply displaying, I am simply displaying what is there. But as long as Citations is contingent on this identity formation of like, this is a scholar, this is his work, then of course we fall into the trap. Like, of course, now we have to verify the dignity of the writer and so on. Yeah.
No, I'll give it to Chiton. I think that's an extremely good point. Citations are absolutely used as like ethics signaling to say, oh, my ideas are good because Hegel said it, as opposed to is the idea good or not. In one of the stories we do called the digressions, now a lot of people by glass bead game mean a lot of different things. But for me, my understanding of Hermann Hesse with the glass bead is, oh, look, I got all these citations. Oh, I can reference these ideas and link them together. Oh, I collected more than you. Ha ha. You know, and it's like education becomes just a glass bead game of collecting citations to imply power over one another. And then for Hermann Hesse, the world outside the academia is like destroyed, basically, because academia just became a place of glass bead exchange and showing off glass beads, ergo citations, and therefore education died. So I think that point, that is absolutely a danger that I think is at play. And then the question is, but can we use but is there still something about the citation that can be used in a good way? Fire can cook food, or I can catch something on fire, and burn it, right? So the citation, I think, is a very good point. Chiton, please.
I completely sort of take the point in that sense. I myself not against citation as such, but I do sort of, when I write, I do realize that citation as part of a publishing industry is not meant to be authentic to the citation of sources. It's meant to be part of certain economics. And let's be honest about that. That today when we cite, we are not just citing in that sense to be, getting into dialogue with the people whose ideas they are. We are doing it primarily to sort of being part of certain publishing industry whose ethics are not directly overlapping with this principle of citation that we're trying to come up with. For instance, if I say, let's take my recent paper, the Jusans one. So there are certain these big moments in the paper that I'm thinking about. I will cite Deleuze, I will cite Lacan, whatever. But there are things in the paper which I will depend on a lot on secondary sources. For example, if I were to think Jusans, it's not the concept that I'm reading every day. So what I'll do is I will go and find certain secondary literature upon it where it will be explained in a concise manner, so that I can have an easy time telling the reader what those ideas are, which are there in the back of my mind, but which I might not cite that source. It happens more often than not. I will not, because if I start citing that source, that takes away from the reading of the text itself. Am I right? And we all do it in that sense. If we write, we all, for instance, with Nietzsche also. So I would quote Deleuze because with Deleuze, I'm in dialogue with. But there are a lot of writers that I'm blogs that I'm reading on the site to articulate certain points, which I know these are my points, but I want to articulate them through certain, knowing that my language is correct and double checking myself and so on and so forth. But I will not cite those sources because they will take away from the reading. If I start citing them, I have to give them the credit for what they are saying, and that what they're saying is not actually important to what I'm saying. To be honest. It happens in almost everything I write, where I know that my citations are not simply a part of, telling that this idea came from here, but they are a signal or for the reader, they are sort of a map through which they can understand which writers I'm entering a dialogue with, which thinkers I'm entering a dialogue with. It's not that everything that I'm citing is, and I think this is across the board. Of course, when I do my professional academic work, I'm much more stricter when I do write for, anthologies or book chapters and stuff like that. I'm much more on my own creative zone, which is I enjoy writing over here. Here I don't have to worry about, and that's why those things take a longer time in that sense. On the question of how do you separate good cheating from bad cheating is very interesting. It's almost like separating good repetition from bad repetition. Isn't it? And I'll not sort of get into it too much because it will take a long time. But I remember Wittgenstein having this very interesting idea that rules are like signposts. that they tell you, you go straight, take a right from there. It's like that. You may follow it, you may not follow, you may take a left, take a long turn, come back on the same road from somewhere else. Rules are not meant to be, in that sense, totalized upon the subject, because the minute you totalize the rules upon the subject, you take away the subject's own capacity to decide, his own judgment from the equation itself. And if you have to keep that minimal subject's thinking or judgment involved in the thing, in the systemic move, you have to leave the room to play with the rules. And that playing with the rules will always appear cheating to those who are at a disadvantaged end of that play. Isn't it? And that minimal play is necessary to keep the system alive, to keep the system rejuvenated within itself. Otherwise, the rules themselves become, in some senses, static, oppressive, but there's a better word. In Hindi, we have a word, in English, I can't really think myself the word right now. But the system itself becomes, in some senses, stale. It becomes, something which needs to be fueled with some kind of new material in that sense. And I think that's what is at stake in this setting,
Yeah, really good points, Chetan. If I may just tag right onto the back of that. I got a very felt impression, if I look back on my years inside of the university system versus my years after the university system, that actually the methodologies associated with citation that I was trained in were in some sense anti-creative. Like there was an anti-creative spirit instantiated in the whole process, which basically said you cannot have original ideas. Almost that's a dangerous property. It's not something to be encouraged. You are basically being trained to be a very skillful participant in a kind of highly scientific warfare of ideas that are already available. And the best player of the academic game is the one who can pull together those ideas and argue them most effectively. And you have to be a goddamn genius to be able to actually somehow bring an original thought into that, pulling together what's there. It certainly can be done, but it's not necessarily the spirit of the system. And it was only coming out of that, more or less changing course completely, not participating in an academic context, writing more from a creative pursuit standpoint, then I was able to start writing things which were in some sense academic, in some sense intellectual, but much more actually of my own spirit, and therefore much more connected with the most important insights that I was having in life. And of course, then that, over time, potentially drawing some dots between those and other people and situating it so people can see, okay, he's kind of getting these ideas a bit from here and these from there. I think that's absolutely helpful. But for me, going back to that stage of like every goddamn line in this thing is going to be cited, that's a very particular kind of competitive game that is not particularly generative for me at all.
I've had, like, you touched the raw nerve for me, actually. I've had really bad experiences with people whom my guides and stuff in there. So multiple times it happens, certain things that are very obvious for me in that sense, which I know because I'm reading philosophy for a long time and so on and so forth, where certain ideas are very, very obvious. You take them to, somebody in the system who's higher up, your guide or whatever, and you show them the write-up. And because that idea is not obvious for them, they will say, where's the citation? The problem is there is no one citation for those things. You will play a game there. You will cheat in some senses. You will write one author's name. But that is something which may be true for across the board for many multiple thinkers. For instance, if you want to say that narrative is incomplete in the postmodern thought, narratives are fundamentally incomplete structures. Something like this might be, you might ask for citation to say this. But this is true across Foucault, Derrida, say downright, leotard, so on and so forth, you would realize that in fact citations becomes a way to police the thought at this level. They become a way to tell you that you do not have to push the boundaries. You say things that are safe to say. Minute you're entering into the unsafe territories, you will be controlled through asking for what is the citation for this. And minute you say, I am saying this, they will say, what is the evidence for it? And then you get into the game of, justifying or giving evidence of something that is being said by a million people in a million other ways, million contexts in that sense. And that's a very tricky game, because when you start giving evidence for it, you're getting trapped into that, into their structure. I'm just sort of sorry taking it on. Yeah.
It would be difficult for me to stress how much I appreciate this comment. Dimitri, it's good to see you, my friend. Absolutely, citation is actually used to. I don't have to think about what you just wrote because you didn't cite it. And if you cited it, I know it's good without thinking about it. So it removes thought. It is absolutely totalitarian in some respects. And I would argue that one of the reasons most people basically cannot write is because they've taught to be collectors. They've not been taught to be thinkers. They've been taught to be researchers and collectors. And then they get out of school and they're like, oh, I don't know how to think. Well, no, you don't, because all you ever did was collect and string together. And so it's a terrible culture. And there is no doubt that this citation culture as such is oppressive. I think there's a big difference between when you cite out of school, you're citing to acknowledge a friend or to acknowledge an inspiration or to encourage dialogue. And citation in that sense is for the generation of thought and creativity, not the oppression of thought. Because the glass bead game is you're not allowed to talk unless you have a glass bead you can trade. You have to have a glass bead and you trade it off in different things and who has the most. It is absolutely destructive. And I think also the thing you were also saying about like the reading experience, personally, oh, and I also just want to say that basically at school, this problem of having to, you're only allowed to write a paper where you basically just repeat what someone else said. Yeah, that's why I didn't do good in school, because I was like, F you. Like, I'm not doing that crap. It's nonsense. And then when I found 4 professors or people who liked papers that weren't just citations, I just took 10 classes with them and said, screw everyone else, because it's ridiculous. The problem is also the professors are great in 100 papers. They don't want to think about every paper. Oh, you have citations. Oh, okay, that sounds good. Bam, I know it's a good idea. I don't have to be critical about it because you cited Derrida, whatever. It is part of the machine. And so cheating this system is good, right? Because you're escaping the oppression to create, right? Or not following the law or the rules is a good thing. I think also with the reading experience for me, that problem comes out in writing history a lot. I'm thinking about Hayden White, on the Scholar of Writing History, or Selby Foote, who said he didn't put citations in his Civil War trilogy, basically because the citation experience removes you from the story, and history only changes you if you are pulled into the story of history and feel it emotionally, and citations get in the way of history, teaching you history, because you don't experience it as a literature that does meet you emotionally. That is why I personally will use endnotes instead of footnotes. Now, the problem with endnotes is you have to go to the back of the book to see the citations, but I don't want at the bottom of the page a constant reminder that there are citations. I want them out of the way as much as possible for the reading experience to be immersive. Now, a problem can be is that for more academically trained people, if the citation is not there, it's cumbersome, but from a literature standpoint, endnotes are superior, actually. So for me, from a literary consideration, I tend to gravitate toward endnotes, while more academic people gravitate toward footnotes, precisely because of the problem of the reading game. And I want to signal as little as possible that this is that there are like authorities, right? Now, of course, if I'm going to write belonging again, since I'm constantly in dialogue with Philip Reif, I am going to cite Philip Reif, but how do I get that academic out of the way as much as possible? And that's a really, really, I think, a very deep style problem that comes out in the writing of history severely. But there is no doubt, and I'll give it to Javier, but the stuff you said on Wittgenstein I actually think is really big, and I was talking to Sanduni on thinking about moral games like language games in Wittgenstein, and how Wittgenstein's framework of the language game actually might help with the ethical game. And what you see here is the institution creating ethical games that define terms in light of those ethical games for the suppression of thought or the maintaining of the institution. And the question would be, would AI help us break out of those or not? And then I guess I will say quickly, it's almost, and then I'll give it to you, Javier. And I fear because of the oppression of the system, this is one of the busiest weekends of the entire year at the venue, and I have to go set up a bunch of tables and chairs and different things. So I will have to go in like 30 minutes, like 3:10 or whatever. But I've really enjoyed this conversation because all of this is so freaking critical. I also was going to say, it's almost like, Javier, the difference between, because there is a sense in you don't want to be caught not having read the book. You could say that's a status thing. You don't want to be humiliated, so it's status. But it's almost like there's a difference, though. It's like you don't want to be the person who's part of the group who's not helping, who's not contributing to truth. It's not really a status thing. It's like in a it's not status. It's like, oh, they haven't read Hegel, so the conversation almost gets like slowed down, or it gets off track on undefined terms or whatever, so it kind of hurts it, which seems different from a social status of, oh, I want everyone to know, I want to read Hegel so people know I've read Hegel. Well, that's bad. Who gives a crap? But then there's a form of it is, I want to read Hegel so when I'm in that small group, I can contribute to the small group flourishing. And that seems to be similar, but different. And that's what's curious to me. Like right here is these nuanced difference. There's a difference between the citation that's trying to honor a friend or generate conversation and the citation that's being used to oppress thought. There's a difference between social status, I'm going to read Hegel so I'm not embarrassed, and I'm going to read Hegel in order to be generative. It's these very fine distinctions that may also be part of getting at the difference between good cheating and bad cheating, right? These very fine distinctions that we have to think. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera.
So actually, Badiou, he's actually brought a very interesting distinction between inclusion and belonging that I find kind of fruitful here when he argues about the void. He basically says the void doesn't belong to any particular multiple or one, but is inclusive in every single multiple and one as a kind of form of privation. I really like this idea mainly because you can apply it to almost every thing that you face, right? Like the concept that you brought up, Daniel, is exactly that, right? If you get fixated on status, you want to belong. But if you genuinely want to read Hegel, it's because you want to be included. You want to participate in truth. You want to be included in the pursuit of truth. So suddenly there's a distinction here between, instead of belonging to the notion of the status of me being somebody that's read, rather than being included, which is available to all of us, rather than kind of belonging. It seems like for Badiou, at least in the sense that he kind of defines belonging, it seems more like, was it hegemonic in a sense, like it has to deal with possession. I want to belong, so I'm going to possess all this other stuff. But I do think I find this distinction between belonging and inclusion very useful, because it sort of prevents this idea of just wanting to be a status symbol. I am reading simply to become a status symbol. Rather, I have a desire to be included and participate in truth. The other thing that I've noticed in my time in school is that, like Chitan said, citation definitely becomes like a part of the system to where like no thinking is really involved. One of the most apparent examples that I figured out that people weren't thinking anymore is when we had to critique a specific writer in my psychology of religion class, and people were panicking because they could not find the critique. They could not find a cited critique. And I was laughing because I was like, you don't need to find a cited critique. Why do you need to find a cited critique? The critique is within the system itself. I was like, why does that need to be a thing for you to be able to cite a critique? But the thing is, they start panicking because they don't know if the critique is good, right? So that means they have no measure from which to stand on how do I know if a critique is good if I can't cite it, if I can't reference it back to some other critique. For me, this exposes the gap already. Like the fact that you can't critique without referring back to some person that has already critiqued the idea means that we're not thinking, like Chitan is saying, that we're just simply collecting to refer back to say that, yes, my idea is good because it has this backup and it has this structure status. I think this is where Badiou is useful in the sense that this is the anxiety of the void right here. Like the fact that you have no structure to lean on to cite back to. You have nothing. That's exactly the point. You have literally nothing, and yet you have to make something the nothing out of something, the nothing into something. I mean, so yeah, I feel like if school starts off with the practice of critiquing, it would establish this idea of like, I'm having a dialogue with a writer, and I don't necessarily need to cite everything that he's saying, because it is obvious that I'm having a dialogue with this specific writer, which allows the person to already start thinking on their feet about what is the problem with this system, what do you think could be the gaps in the system, and so on. And then maybe as a foundation, you can start going into more creative thinking. Like, there's something about critique that feeds the creativity of the thinker, right? Because right now in school, I've noticed that everybody likes to function within the system that is presented, you know, and the way they counter that system is they find another system. But what I'm saying is, what if you can't find another system? You know, people, that's where people like to use citations, to refer to another system to counter the system that is being presented. But what if you can't do it? What if I told you, no, you can't refer back, come up with your own critique? What are you going to say now? They already start having anxiety because they've never done this before. They don't know what it means to critique this system without referring to another system to critique to. So this establishes them in the void immediately, in my opinion.
Let me pass it to Mr. Kishere. You said so many things right there that are so important. And I will note that belonging can absolutely do in what Badu is saying. That's why, like, we talk a lot in the book about belonging again, the return, where if you just belong like classically, then it can just be the mass, as we call it. The trick now is belonging again in the book, where you got to go through belonging, then release. But what does it look to have belonging in terms of release? This is the last step. So Badu is correct on that. I don't use the term inclusion, but I agree with the sentiment he's putting forth with that danger. But Mr. Kishere.
Thank you. Yeah, really love what you just said, Javier. Yeah, precisely what you were saying. If the thought hasn't been thought before, right? If you're in 2020 and you're writing a paper in critique of patriarchy, then you already have the feminist movement to go back and cite the feminist movement. But if that hasn't happened yet, if you're in the paradigm that doesn't have a counter paradigm, where does that occur inside of an academic context? It probably has to actually happen inside of like the art world, maybe that's probably where that stuff was occurring, art, counterculture outside, and then gradually that stuff gets brought into the university. So really excellent point. And there's a lot of invisible paradigms that we're going to need to be busting out of, many of which are not just a matter of bringing a counter to an existing paradigm, but moving through the ideas in a way that is paradigmatically different. Moving from a linear fashion to an integral fashion is not really about bringing a counter inside of a linear framework. It's moving in a different way, and that's not necessarily something that shows up purely through citation either. But to a more dark and potent concern that Daniel raised about the totalitarian quality of this, I really, really think it's important to bring up the weaponization of citation during the COVID years. And it is really interesting that it was more on the progressive, educated, more college graduate class that was most heavily in support of and in propagation of the narrative of the institutions, which rested so heavily on the force of citation as a kind of self-evident demonstration of truth. And so that naturally flowed out into Facebook, and it flowed down into these WHO citations on everything, and it really ultimately became a tool of suppressing all dissent and appeal to authority. And then you had kind of citation wars going on broken out of the university in real life between different groups, and that seemed to also somehow demonstrate a breakdown in the paradigm of citation as well, because it's just such a wide variety. And it was almost like people outside of the fixed game and the culture of the university started to play the same game, but then to different ends, and it just kind of unraveled, and the game itself wasn't sufficient to actually find our way to truth at all.
No, I think that's a magnificent connection. I really like the phrase citation wars, because I think often when people say, oh, we're in a post-truth world, that's not what I've observed. What I've observed is a citation war. That's much closer to it, where people have different sets of facts and they don't agree on the facts. But the problem is, if facts are always mediated through authorities, then you could say, well, these authorities say this, this is this. And basically what it goes to show you is if you've been taught that you can only think through citations, this is the logical end. You eventually become the donkey caught between two evenly piles of grain. These citations over here say this. These citations over there say this. And basically what it shows you, COVID is a wonderful example where if all you can do is think according to citations, you're done. Like there has to be the active element of thinking to break the tie between the different citation wars, because then ultimately it's going to be like, well, my citations have more authority than yours. I don't buy the premise. Or my citations don't say that. My citations say they have more authority than your citations. So you're done. Everyone becomes a donkey standing between those piles of grain. No one can move. And then it's a war. So I think COVID and a lot of these examples now that are happening in the news, like the news is basically full of examples of the logical end of people who can only think according to citations. And you get stuck in a citation war. And actually, one of the things that I'm getting kind of hopeful for is, everyone's like, I wonder if precisely the post-factness, where everyone's like, we can't trust fact checkers. I wonder if you're going to almost start having dialogue checkers. And this is something I think about with the popularity of podcasts. I wonder if increasingly more people are realizing that the only way to check things is to listen to entire dialogues, because facts are so just like almost subconsciously realizing. Now, everyone, of course, can just go to their podcast. I understand that. But there's at least a sense of wow, like we really have to have a full going through of the information. But no, when I'll give it to Javier here, when everyone is stuck just thinking according to citations, you're just, it's not post-truth, it's citation war. I think that's a better term. Now, of course, the caveat is there is real authority and there are conspiracies, and people cite things for, different conspiracies they get stuck in, or magical thinking or whatever. But then also people act like it's self-evident what conspiracies are false and what are true. And you go back in history and there are lots of true conspiracies. So not even that can be said with such ease, right? But no, I think a lot of the modern world is a reflection of what happens when you have a people that aren't allowed to think beyond citation. They just have to fall back on their citations versus the other citations, and their citations don't cite the other citations. Therefore, everyone is stuck. And then it's just power, basically. But let me give it to Javier.
This is where I think thinking is almost like void-like in nature, mainly because it exposes the gap between structures, right? Like the fact that, and I really love Derrida's take on like the gift of death when he talks about the aporia of responsibility, where it's like the fact that you have to depend on a structure of knowledge to decide to do something is already irresponsible for Derrida. Like this is the contradiction of sorts, right? Like how do you make a decision in the midst of not knowing what to make a decision about? And this became most apparent in COVID, where I had just started getting into philosophy, and I definitely struggled, like Jacob was pointing out, figuring out how to navigate between what's true, what's not true. Because if you listen to the left, you get all this stuff, and then you listen to the right, you get all the counter stuff to it. And you're just sitting there looking through all the notations and citations. You're like, I don't know what is true anymore. And then you're sort of left helpless in a kind of sense. You're like left to your own neurotic tendencies at this point, where you're like, I'm just going to pick somebody and just have faith that this is what is true. And ever since I started reading philosophy, I'm not worried about these discrepancies anymore. Like these discrepancies don't even bother me anymore. Because I can finally look at what is being presented and think about what is being said, rather than taking for granted what is said in correspondence to my decision making. Right? That's a totally different avenue of thinking, that you don't just take what is presented as the authority. You think through what is presented, and then you choose. This is the only way to deal with Derrida's contradiction, that you think through what is being presented, and then You know, because it's not that you just take the structure of knowledge that is presented to you. You think through the structure that is presented to you, and then you decide. Then in that sense, it is your responsibility. That is you being responsible. But you being responsible is not taking for granted the structure of knowledge and then contrasting the other structure of knowledge. You have to think through this. And that's my problem. Nobody even knows how to think through this. And ChatGPT actually exposes this gap once again, because now you can have a authoritarian non-authority, right? It can be this thing that you just go to get information and it says so, right? But everybody knows that it's not perfect. It's sort of incomplete. So there is still like room for hesitation on this idea. But yeah, that's my thoughts.
So there's a bunch of things. Like, for example, so often with the COVID, you were told, make a decision based on your own risk profile, right? On your own personal situation and so on and so forth. Well, how do I do that? I don't have any citations. Like, literally, it all fell back on that, and you've taken from people the ability to even do a risk assessment. So what are they supposed to do? They don't know what to do. Like you can't at the end, you can't train people through years and years of education to cite everything and then tell them at the end to think for themselves. Okay, yeah, all right, buddy. So a few things. The other thing I was going to say is you see all the time in academia, like, oh, you'll be allowed to think for yourself once you're a PhD or you're a professor, then you can write your own paper. By the time you're a professor, you have so habituated yourself out of the ability to think for yourself that you can't do it. The system loves that. And I can think also of the professors who I adore who talk about, like, now that they're retired and they're 70, they're finally allowed to write the book they want to write. Because they always had meetings, bureaucracies, like the system. Like, you go to school to think for yourself, and then when you're about to die, you can think for yourself. Oh, and you've retired, so the system's not going to publish your book anymore, so no one's going to read it. So it's devious. It's a terrible thing. Generally speaking, I would have to explode. I'm about to explode because this topic is so important to explore this more. Basically, you should only cite to build, never just to repeat. Like, if you are citing someone, it must be for the sake of building an argument, your point, not just to repeat theirs. But basically, academia teaches you that a paper is repetition of another work, but that's not repetition. Like, if you're going to, citation is inherently repetition, okay? So if you're citing to build, you are repeating for the sake of creation, right? So you should always citation should always be to build, never to just repeat. But of course, the system wants education to be repetition because by definition, you repeat the system. If all you can do is repeat, then you must repeat the system, right? And so it becomes a self-solidifying system. A few more things. I'm now thinking about the tree of knowledge and clothing. And like, it's almost like citation is putting on clothing. You're like, crap, I'm naked. Let me get some clothing. Oh, Hegel said, Heidegger said, I'm cited. Like, it's like clothing. And what if, like, the tree of knowledge, because, you'll talk about Javier, like, Adam and Eve, they already knew good and evil, so they wanted what they already had. It's almost like the fall was citation. Because now you could say, the snake did it. God is good. The snake is evil, as opposed to just know it for yourself. Now it's like, it's almost a difference between knowledge and thinking. Because what do people do with citations? They're like, no, I know the truth because I have these citations. I don't have to think about it. I know about it. So it's the difference between knowing good and evil versus thinking good and evil. So the problem with the tree is you're knowing good and evil because you're just citing things external from yourself and you're not owning it, as opposed to thinking good and evil, right? So perhaps the fall is citation. So way to go, college. You're making us all end up like friggin' Adam. Good job, guys. And then, of course, what's the first thing that happens after the fall? Adam, which refers both to man and woman, suddenly becomes Adam and Eve. This is very important. It's not Eve until after the fall. So the fall leads to a division of Adam to Adam and Eve. And what do citations do? Us versus them. My facts versus your facts. Like, citation inherently creates division, whereas thinking good and evil is almost inherently communal, just like we're doing here. Like, to think through things, you have to do community, right? And it becomes a communal sharing of an essence. And it's funny because in that environment, you really can't cheat. You said it before. It's like, it's really hard to imagine what cheating is in a social environment. So Adam and Eve couldn't do any evil. They couldn't do any cheating because they were in community to think through these things. But then after the fall, it was the possibility of a bad cheating. Now, more can be said about this interesting question of good and bad cheating, which I find very interesting. And it's almost like after that division, and then I'll give it back to Javier, and then I fear I must run. Like if we think about Jesus, and he's not washing his hands before he's eating, the Pharisees come along, he's like, dude, you're not washing your hands. You're cheating. You're cheating, Jesus. And he's like, nope, we don't have to do this because the Son of Man here. So Jesus is a really good cheater. He's cheating the Rabbinic traditions all the time, but for the sake of the unleashing of the Holy Spirit and resurrection, right? So Jesus, after the fall in a citation world, basically, has to cheat in the citation world to get it out of the citation world. So there is a form of good cheating that emerges in the midst of bad cheating. That's what kind of happens, because if, it's like Walker Percy said, if everyone is standing on their head, you have to look like you're standing on your head to show people how to stand right side up, right? So likewise, if everyone is like in a world of citation or oppression or power dynamics that aren't actually generated, then precisely to show people how to not do that, how to be creative and to move beyond that into a new life, then you have to look like the cheater in the midst of that system, but actually you are the crack in the system to open it up to the generative possibilities that then lead to something new. In the same way, like, and I'll give to Javier, like, I think it's really, really important. Basically, like, one of the reasons I think a lot of people don't do academic, like, conversations like we're doing here at the Net is precisely because you cannot really cite in a conversation. How do you cite in a conversation? You really can't. Like every now and then you say Deleuze said, Hegel said, whatever. But 90% of a dialogue or conversation like this has no citation. Well, guess what? If you've been trained to only think with citation, this becomes impossible for you, basically. Or it's so out of your, like, who am I to talk about government or COVID or philosophy, right? People do that all the time. They're nervous when they start talking about ideas, right? They're like, yeah, I don't know. That's all citation culture. That all comes from a citation culture. And basically, the funny thing is that this kind of dialogue somehow points to the new form of education or something critical for thinking, then it is inherently the good cheating of the bad cheating of the citation culture, right? You guys are cheating. You're talking about ideas without citing them. We're doing it now. You don't have credentials. You don't have authority. You're cheating. You're not allowed to talk about this stuff unless you have the authority. This would be the good cheating. This is unveiling the crack to open up the system. But you also have to be the kind of person that says, F it, I'm going to talk about stuff even if I can't cite it. F it, yeah, I've thought through these ideas. I'm going to talk about it. So there's a kind of, yeah, bring it. Like, here, we're going to create a situation. We're going to try to change the state of academia by creating a new situation that has a communal character that is seen in these liminal webs precisely to be the crack in the possibility of new thinking, of which is going to become very quickly very evident that we must engage with because AI is going to replace everything else. This is the human form of intelligence, the thinking good and evil that we are possible of doing, that AI is going to come along and say, hey, I know good and evil, baby. I'm really good at that. I am the ultimate citer. I'm so good at citing that I can go through millions and millions of files online and aggregate them all together into an answer. I can cite the human race. What can you do? Well, I can think through the human race. That's all we got going for us.
Wonderful, Daniel. This is what I love about humanities in general, because humanities, and actually a lot of scientific people struggle with humanities because they start discovering that everything is opinionated, right? Everything is still a continuous debate about what culture means, what does art mean, what does everything else mean. But science and that whole realm is like, yes, these are the facts, and so on and so on. So it builds a kind of security. But what I've noticed is that even when speaking, I can tell when somebody's new to the group and they're like getting adjusted to philosophy because they hesitate about speaking because they don't know everything. But that's the whole point, is that we don't know everything. And here I know enough that even when I talk about belonging from Badiou, I know enough that in this structure, Daniel doesn't mean, when he says belonging, it's not Badiou's belonging. And yet a scientific mindset would be attacking Daniel for saying, like, no, you're applying Badiou's kind of belonging and so on, because that's what they would think. But immediately I know that's not what Daniel thinks, because I've had a history of talking with him, and I know when he says belonging, that is not what Badu is referencing. If anything, it's probably more on the lines of inclusion, if I were to make a correspondence. But it's very important that thinking is almost groundless in a way, but you do need some type of, like you could say, some type of walking bridge to jump off from, right? You take these ideas to then reach that point where you have to take a leap, right? Because you'll never be able to have read all the thinkers, understand them perfectly. Like right now, I'm sacrificing myself for being an event. I do find it very interesting, but I think it's very important that somebody like understands Badu very well. So I'm taking that kind of initiative on myself to understand Badu. But yes, anyways, this historicity of thought is very important, because the whole point of dialogue is to not repeat the same ideas, but to reach something new, reach a kind of break in thought. You know, this is why people panic when speaking, because all they have is that dependence on a structure of knowledge. And this is why it's so important to even speak when you don't know what you're saying at a certain point. You're like, you know what, I think this is what I think it is, and I'm sticking with it. And if I get slaughtered, then I get slaughtered. But if thinking is anything like love, then it has to be the one thing that's not offered. You have to, and yet thinking demands an offering, right? Similar to the way I present love. You have to present the offering to understand that thinking is always more than what is offered. That for me is what people seem to misunderstand completely when they start quoting knowledge and everything else, is that knowledge is also the one thing that's not offered, but I have to offer something in order for us to get something beyond what is offered. I'll end there.
Yes. So there's a bunch of things. Thinking is by definition groundless. If you know, you don't have to think. That's why it's like knowledge is a kind of fall, because there's no thinking. You know good and evil. You have a ground now. You don't have to think. Thinking is the act of creation. Thinking, basically, I don't think it's by chance that as thinking has been replaced with knowing, and also the emphasis on citation is based on a skepticism of the subject. I don't trust you, so cite it, where it's anti-subject in favor of objective, be objective. How is citing Hegel objective? He was a person too. Like, it's crazy in the humanities. Like, they were a person too. You know that, right? Yeah, but they've gone through history and had all this testing and whatever. Well, maybe it's just the Foucault norms captured the dialogue, and that's why we study them, right? Like, so how can you say they have authority just because we study them? Maybe that's a self-relating confirmation bias or whatever. Hegel was a person too. I think it's extremely clear in the science of logic that he is wrestling with his own mind and not always entirely sure what he's saying, but also writing to know what he's saying, because the act of writing is the chiseling it inward to get at what you're saying and working it through, rewriting, and so on and so forth, right? He was a person. And so he is at war with his own subjectivity. So if I cite Hegel, it should be in service of the wrestling like Jacob in Israel with my own subjectivity, just like Hegel is. He would want me to cite him for the sake of that battling with my subjectivity, not to replace my subjectivity. I don't think any of the great philosophers, well, I talk about Austin Farrow with this. Like, Austin Farrow is like, guys, do you really think that Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica so you could get a PhD in the Summa Theologica? Do you really think that's why he did it? I'm pretty sure it was to help you ascend toward God. Pretty sure about that. Schopenhauer, that part of Will and Representation I always love, he says, modern education, instead of being a man who climbs a ladder toward the sun, is a man who comes along and collects the rungs off the ladder and puts them in a bag so he can carry them around and show them to people. And that is indeed the citation culture, taking rungs off a ladder and showing people the rungs, as opposed to using the rungs to climb, which we're not allowed to do anymore because we don't trust the frickin' subject. In the name of objectivity, we've turned ourselves into objects like rocks, and rocks dream of nothing. So we dream of nothing. We do not think, and we have no motivation, because of people who cannot think and is not allowed to think. The fates of thinking and the fates of motivation are tied together. Intrinsic motivation. I always talk about intrinsic motivation, right? Okay, groundlessness, which is the playing with possibility because you are not bound by a ground, is precisely the act that creates the motivation to keep doing it. Thinking engenders intrinsic motivation, and intrinsic motivation engenders thinking. They go together. We know this. You could take Pascal's example. Pascal has that part where he says, all the world's problems is a result of people being unable to sit in a room quiet, right? He's like, people can't sit still in a room quiet, and that's why the world is screwed up. And if you think about it, kind of true, because you're checking your phone. Like, the moment you look at your phone, the world's ending, you're nervous and you're anxious and you're going through it. Like, no, put your phone down, just sit still in a room. And suddenly the stuff that's going on the news isn't that big of a deal. Suddenly all of the world breaking news, we're all going to die. You're fine, right? So literally what you think about transforms who you are. And the problem is, here's the issue. When you aren't allowed to think, you're still going to think. You're just going to think what other people think, and you're going to be anxious, nervous, and just lost in the freaking YouTube or whatever, right? So the choice to not think in favor of citation knowledge is actually a lie, because it's not possible not to think, so you end up pathological. You're doing the impossible. That's the problem with the knowledge of the tree and good and evil. It's not possible to actually know good and evil unless you're God, and yet you replace thinking with knowledge, so you're not allowed to think when you must think, so it's a pathological snake eating its own tail. That's what's happening to all of us. We're not allowed to think. The only things therefore, the only things that motivate us is the anxiety that is coming from the external systems to us in the education system by training us to only think in accordance with citation, is priming us to be unable to think or be motivated beyond the external feed that we are receiving that makes us anxious, uncreative. And then when we come into a space when we might converse, dialogos, philosophy, or different things, or explore new ideas, we're nervous and not allowed to do it because we've been trained not to do it. So the medicine to our plight is illegal. And then we wonder why we're all sick mentally and healthily. And, we're just mentally sick, basically, in different ways. And because the very things that can help you engage in the thinking to motivate you, to pull you out of these various ruts. And I know I'm not saying all mental illness is a result of this. I'm just saying that feeling, that getting down, you are not allowed to engage in that because the education system has trained you to not engage with that. A few more things. Also, too, what you were saying about words and the knowing the difference between belonging, Badu, and how I mean it, that's a meta skill. We talked about meta skill. Jacob and I talked about meta skills, the ability to kind of just know, oh, that's not what he means. Let me think of it from a different angle. In the same way that people use citations to oppress, they are rigid about language to oppress because they're citing the definition of the term. That's a form of citation. Oh, the definition of belonging is this. So you're not able to be mobile in your language. That is another act of totalitarianism. Now, of course, without definition, you don't have definition, so there's chaos, but that's the whole belonging again, Gibbons and releases, Philip Reeve stuff, right? But definitely people who are rigid in their language, in the same way that people are rigid about your interpretation of Hegel. No, that's not what Hegel said. That's not what Hegel said. That's a citation move. That's another example of a citation war. Rigidness about term is a citation war. Like if we're talking the citation war versus the post-truth, like that's a product of the citation war. Adamant on interpretation is a product of the citation war. Authorities, these are all products of the citation war that are in direct conflict with the engaging of thinking that engenders intrinsic motivation. And I would argue that intrinsic motivation, although we have to complexify that as we've done in previous net conversations, because you have to go through the crucible of extrinsic motivation, so it's not childish. We've had that conversation, but assuming that is all part of it, that is one of the things that make you alive, because you wake up in the morning and you're like, I know what to do. Well, buddy, if you can wake up in the morning and know what to do, and it's not knowing what to do because it's given to you by the system in the 9 to 5, then you've gone a long way to being human. If the only way that you know what to do is because the system gives you a 9 to 5, then you are missing out on the possibility and joy that is found in a life of thinking that can engender the intrinsic motivation that can give you an alternative. But you have to escape the oppression of the citation system in order to engage in that. And the hope, if I'm to be positive, and then I fear I must run, although I have a lot more notes because this is so important. I've really enjoyed it. I'm glad everyone is here. If I am hopeful, my hope is precisely that because AI is basically going to be way better than any of us at citing anything, that the whole idea of human education being about various forms of citation that replace building as opposed to aid building, that's going to be nuked. That's going to be done for. And so basically, even if people have been habituated to not engaging in this kind of thinking, there's going to be a forcing function to make them engage with this kind of thinking or fall into really, really deep pathology. AI is going to be a forcing function. And in my opinion, there's a good argument to be made. Everyone's talking about AI replacing humanity. It actually might end up making us more human, precisely because it forces us to do the things that make us human, which is not the citation, but the act of thinking and creation. And AI might be the forcing function for learning the meta skills, for engaging in this creative thinking as opposed to citation and engaging in the emergence of the dialogos, all of which would say, just maybe, because of that forcing function, we might finally have the courage, because I think that's part of it, because citation trains you to be afraid to think for yourself, just as Jacob was pointing in the comments. Well, suddenly you're going to come up with a whole lot of courage, because I'll tell you what, you'd be amazed at what you can do and what fears you can overcome when the adrenaline hits. You know, you may have before always been scared of snakes, but when there's a snake in the kitchen and it's poisonous and it's going towards your child, you are suddenly Superman. You can crush its head, you can take it off, you can overcome fear just like that. And my hope is that AI might end up being a source of adrenaline for the human race to help it face the fear that it is engendered through habits of education and society, not to think for itself, but to instead cite. And just maybe in that, we can start to make up for that original fall in the garden, which was to eat from the tree of knowledge and to go back to a state where we think good and evil as opposed to know good and evil, which just makes us end up as a snake eating our own tail. Anyway, I do have to run to work. I've really enjoyed this. This is such a critical topic. You guys are all beautiful. Thank you all for coming by. I've really enjoyed it. So I'm glad we got into citation because I think it is such a critical topic. So thank you all. You're all beautiful.